I think a topic has been brought up several times now that's probably worth digging out is the idea about the individual vote. And that's not always the case, I think, that a lot of people do, is the vote on your own or the silent vote, Steve, you called it. So what's the practice there about individual votes versus, I know some classes use clickers and it's straight into discussion.
Is there any research?
Yes. So, I mean, I adopted the individual vote practice because I had some research questions that I wanted to answer. And we now have 2 published papers on this because we were curious about being able to demonstrate the discussion of the clicker questions was actually helping the students learn. So the only way to do that is to first take a measure of what they actually think on their own before they do anything else, and then have them discuss, revote, and then we had the students answer another question that was similar to the first question on their own. So we had a way of measuring, okay, what's the baseline knowledge, then there's a discussion, it goes up, the percent correct goes up, and then if you ask them another question, can they apply what they just learned in discussion to a new question? So I don't always use the individual vote, but if you want to see growth, you need to use the individual vote to get a measure of what the students actually know on their own.
So Jenny, can you comment on why you don't always use that approach then?
It takes more time.
Okay.
So if you want to ask 10 clicker questions in a 50-minute class period, for example, if you were really wanted to ask a lot of questions, you couldn't do it with an individual vote before each one and have time left over for any meaningful discussion of the material or the questions. So it depends a little bit on how many questions I have that I'm thinking I want to ask, because it does take more time to ask the individual
So
vote.
Jenny, you were using the silent vote to gather evidence that the discussion had a significant effect.
Yes.
So the question I want someone to answer is a silent vote followed by a discussion vote improve learning any better than just one discussion vote, no silent vote?
There's no way to measure that. Because you don't know what they knew before the discussion.
Well,
you have to
you could
assess
imagine
it in a different way.
some ways of assessing that.
In the classroom, there's no way to assess it.
But I think the answer is, I mean, you could imagine Max is able
I
to,
have thought about it.
well, we could talk about that. Right.
Math, yes.
But Chandra examined some of this. I'll channel Chandra a little bit. That, so she focused on this. It totally depends on the questions in some sense, and with the social practices that are established in the classroom. So in some of the classrooms that she studied, the thought, a clicker question was open, and the classroom was silent for 30 seconds and quiet. And the thought is, and her interviews with some of the students, is that students were coming up, trying to make sense of what was going on, and internalizing the silent vote question. Then once they have something to talk about, and say, I think the answer is B, is when you turn to your neighbor. And again, it depends on the social practices, and it depends on the nature of the question that are established in the classroom. But she did observe that sometimes, and it's this hybrid model, which I think when it works best in physics, works that way.
So just one more thing on that, directly related to what you're saying, Noah, is that I think, so again, in another related study where what I'm really interested in is what students are saying to each other during the discussion, apropos of the article that Mike sent around recently from the physics group. We were asking some similar questions about what the discussion was actually doing for the students in terms of their understanding. And for that also, I wanted an individual vote, because I wanted them to commit to something before they entered into the discussion. Because in my mind, I was thinking, well, I want them to have an idea in mind before they start discussing. That forces them to have an idea. Maybe the discussion will be more productive. So I wasn't studying that relationship that you're asking about, Mike. But I do think that there are a lot of instances in which the individual vote is beneficial for both you and the student.
Right. The elicit, confront, resolve model would suggest that you should have students commit themselves to an answer before they engage in the conversation.
Whether they do that on their own.
Yeah, they
Right.
might do it even without the formal
Right. They
vote.
might do it without the formal vote.
Certainly, in an anecdotal way, I can say from observing lots and lots of intro courses where multitudes of faculty are using clickers in geology settings, I've heard a lot of students say, I don't know, what do you think? Well, I'm thinking about this, but I don't know about that. So there certainly are student discussions where at least one member has not committed, or at least isn't willing to say it out loud.
Right. But, and it's a little more complicated because we aren't comparing silent followed by discussion to discussion. What we're comparing is silent followed by discussion discussion to 2 clicker questions with 2 discussions. Because, as pointed out, you can ask twice as many clicker questions. You just have discussion rather than ask it twice.
I was going to ask whether, since I'm not a person who has a class to, use as guinea pigs, whether students get frustrated by
That's
the
not what we
process.
do.
I'm looking forward to it. Whether students get frustrated by the process of being asked a question that they have to reflect on and then being asked to discuss it again, or whether, I've seen a little bit, but whether they get tired of answering the same
Sometimes
question twice.
they express frustration with that in the FCQs at the end of the semester, like, how come we had to answer it twice? That was a waste of time. So I have seen those comments before. I wouldn't say that they're pervasive, but they're definitely out.
I wonder if that's because there are other courses where clickers are used in more of the discussion
But I feel this.
format.
I feel this pressure myself in the intro class. I rarely, sometimes, but rarely have the silent question first. And part of the reason is I don't know how long to let that silent question go, and I'm imagining that there's a good chunk of the class for whom the time is being wasted because they've thought of an answer, they've committed to it, and now there
They're
is
just waiting.
hold
Right.
mode. Whereas once the discussion is open, I'm much less worried about time being wasted. They might finish their discussion in the group and move on to talking about what's happening this weekend, but even that may in fact be potentially productive in some social sense. Whereas the just sitting there waiting doesn't feel right to me, so I tend to avoid that.
So in terms of timing the silent vote, I use the Ed Prather approach, which is I read the question, I read through each of the answers, and then I say, okay, if I knew everything, I would answer A. And that's about as much time as I give them for the silent vote. So enough time for them to read it and come up with an initial vote. You don't really want to give...
If the question is one that you can answer on your gut, then that's fine. But if the question requires some analysis or calculation or logical chain, I don't know how you would decide.
Yeah.
It could be that the main purpose of that silent vote is to give students a chance to all be on the same page. Because if you're, I've been listening to conversations before where two of the students have read through and thought about it while the other one's still piecing it together. I've been that student, and it's very confusing when you're trying to listen to the conversation and not get just behind while you're still trying to figure out what you think about the question.
Right.
So, allowing that time for individual processing seems like it could be valuable regardless of whether or not you're having people actually click.
Aren't you also worried, if you only do discussion, worried that there's a substantial fraction of students who are simply going to sit there and wait until their smartphone just for what's going on?
Yes.
Whereas in the individual case, everybody has to think about it first.
I think the key is with the whole individual vote is that it depends on your own classroom. Like you have to figure out what amount of time is right for your students in that classroom on that day. There is no magic bullet. It's not going to be 30 seconds always for everybody. It's going to be, maybe it's 30 seconds for Seth's class this semester, and maybe next semester it's 45 seconds for the same exact questions. It's just, you have to feel your own classroom. It's not.
Can't you just use, I tend to use how much, when I say 80% of the students have answered, then I say, okay, that's, I want everyone else to answer in the next 10 seconds, but that gives me some calibration because every question is different.
Bill, I think it depends on if the incentive for students includes getting the answer correct or not. I think that makes a difference. So, and I guess you can't know what's going on in students' heads either. So even if someone is not quite clear on whether they understand the question or not, if they're listening to other discussion in their group and they're answering, there may be, even if they're not necessarily being outward about their thinking and whether it's changing, hopefully they're getting something out of the process, even if they're going a little bit more slowly and aren't coming to being forced to answer in the way that they really think. I don't know if that makes any sense. It seems like it's easier if it seems like it's more productive. It's easier to have productive discussions. Students are more willing to discuss if they're not so focused on getting the answer right.
Yeah.
That social pressure isn't so
Well,
strong.
if it's a competition for points, why would people even be collaborative? That's
Right, right.
You're kind of setting something up to fail if you're rewarding people for the correct answer. Then they are all just going to listen to the smart person and try to get the correct answer. I think that's a negative feedback loop.
But I
don't
mean,
think
there's
that's
good.
gonna work.
It seems like there's some argument that for motivation, it increases student motivation to take the question seriously also if there's some incentive, at least on some questions or some circumstances, to receive more credit for the correct response.
Yeah.
This
So that's
pa-
sort of another discussion.
This paper that Mike sent out,
Yeah.
the very first link, they had broken down classes into high stakes classes and low stakes classes. In the high stakes classes, correct answer was rewarded with 3 points, and wrong answer was rewarded with 1 point, and the fraction of the grade was I think 10% or so. And in low stakes, it was everybody gets the credit for any answer. And they found something on the order of 20% of the students in the high stakes class just turned to somebody and said, "What's the answer?" B, okay, we're all voting that. And in the low stakes class, had much more of a discussion. So I think it's how you motivate it, and what they're trying to get out of it. Now it was an all or nothing, and it was a very high, 3 to 1 points and 10% of the class grade is I think a lot higher than even those of us who do give points for the right answer. So that made it much more high stakes. I'd say there's probably a medium or a medium low stakes option. You can still give credit for motivation, but not necessarily drive that.
Eric Mazur invented a little algorithm which I have always used, which gives students extra credit rather than credit for clicker questions. So your clicker questions reduce the weighting of exams in the class. So if you were to get no points whatsoever on the clickers, then the exams simply become, that counts for everything. And the more you accumulate on the clickers, it just reduces the weight somewhat on the exams. And then you can add a little bit of bonus for getting the answer right as a motivation to not just click A for extra credit and not even think about it or talk about it. I don't have any evidence for its pedagogical value, but it's definitely, there's plenty of evidence on FCQs that students like this system. So there's like never complaints about clicker points or unfairness. I just don't have those issues.
That's good to hear, because I have heard complaints from students when clickers are a part of their grade and they're expected to be there and it's 10% of their grade. There are the people who say, I don't want to have to come to class.
Right, and I want to respect that. Right.
Yeah, and it's hard to answer that with anything except for, well, you're always in charge of how many points you want to accumulate. You don't have to come to class. You don't have to take the tests either. That's one way you can respond to that.
Kind of aggressive, but yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a different way of approaching it so that it's not a requirement.
Yeah. So it shows them that you value their participation without making it
But
obligatory.
does almost everyone participate?
Yeah.
So then it's not really extra credit anymore.
Oh, it
just-
truly is extra.
mean,
So I
but
actually
it's
assign
just
grades in a traditional manner and then add in the extra credit. I've just
But what I mean is it's just changing the grading scale. That's what I mean. If everyone's participating,
I'm inflating the grades
calling
in my class because they're learning more.
Right.
Kim?
So when the student say I'm a student, I do all my clicker questions, your exam say was weighted 50%, and then you move it down to 40%, and then my clicker questions become 10% of the grade. Does it work something
Those
like
that you got right are going to eat into that 10%. Yeah.
Okay, so we got 70%. Okay, and then my exam is worth 40.
43 at that point.
Cool.
Okay.
And they actually learned the math of that equation much better than most.
So there's one really, the faculty member that I'm working with this semester, you had everyone sign up in clicker teams, and you have a team captain. And in terms of the class, everyone just gets participation points. But he's made it into a contest for charity. So each team had to pick a charity foundation that they're playing for. And so, and he looks at the responses of each team captain, and so they accumulate team points over the semester. And then like half of the clicker groups will get money towards their charity that he's personally doling out. But
He's personally doling out money?
yes.
How much? Wow. That's an interesting idea because that's an interesting idea because it's promoting team continuity. It's promoting this interaction among the group because the group is competing with other groups, and so it's not sacrificing individual student conversations because they're working as a team.
And apparently, once they start accumulating enough points, then they can challenge other teams. So if they
know
think
about
if
that.
they really have the right answer, they can challenge some other team for their points or something. I haven't seen that part of practice yet, but he actually did this in his upper division course last semester. And so now he's doing it in Gen Chem for majors class this semester. So I was worried about the competition part of it, but it's sort of a hybrid between everyone gets participation points, but then the credit for getting it right comes in.
That's interesting. I've never heard of anyone implementing. That's pretty creative.
Other strategies for assigning points or credit or?
I've noticed in the upper division classes I've sat in, they seem to care about it just on the basis of pride. Like the students that I sit near and I try to circulate the whole class usually get pretty excited when they get it right, regardless of whether credit is allocated or not.
Yeah.
I find that's true in the lower division as well. I mean, I have a certain number of questions that are very difficult. Usually you don't get them 40%. Most will get them right. I tell them ahead of time that everybody's going to get full credit for this because I know this is a difficult question. I'm still glad when they get the right answer. But they appreciate the pressures a little bit off.
So some of these discussions make me think about what students are there for, right? Are they there because they want to learn, or are they there because they want to do well on the exams? So that we have this idea that you can get some credit right away by answering the clicker question, or you can get it right, which means that later on when you have an exam or something testing your knowledge, you feel more confident and are maybe more likely to get it right. Or there could be a situation in which there is really no reason ever other than you got it right and you enjoyed it. You feel good about yourself. So I'm thinking about this in this way from the perspective that I don't currently teach with the clicker, and yet at the same time I'm introducing some of the same behaviors in my students that I'm hearing about in your students.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. Lots of questions up there, but I think Noah's question is an important thing. What should we be doing?
Sorry.
What should we be doing? What other things can we be researching? Are there open questions that we could actually be attempting to study in our classes still with clickers?
Well, I think a very important thing we can do, but I don't know how to do it, is to get the word out that only simple, robust technology is going to work. And I regard these complicated clickers like plague. And the reason they're spreading is because people who have never used a clicker imagine that the clicker with the most features is going to be the best. And it's like, you're going to go buy a car. Well, I don't have cars, but I have aircraft carriers, and they can do way more. So let's buy aircraft carriers. So what I'd like is a study showing not so much about student learning, it's just success of adoption of clickers on campuses where simple clickers have been used versus complicated clickers. I don't want to do a controlled test on this campus because complicated clickers damage the classroom. And so
there should be a natural study there. I mean, we can find out other institutions and sample what kinds of.
I've got plenty of anecdotal evidence where I've seen rise and fall of complicated clickers on other campuses that then switched to, the most dramatic was UCB, where Carl Wyman was. They had a blue ribbon panel that investigated all the clickers, and they chose the instruction because it had the most features. And after 5 semesters, the number of classes that were using clickers was 2, and they expected it to be 0 the next semester. So they switched to iClicker, and now they're on our slope.
That seems like a feasible study because the sheer number of institutions alleviates the lack of controls because huge number of institutions but only a small number of models, you might be able to tease something out of a multiple regression when you have that much data.
See,
of course, you have to have access to all that data.
So I would make a suggestion right now is that you would write up that story and get it out there because I don't think you need to do a big study. I think that's hollow on got the right story, and it's completely sensible. And somebody's just got to say it. More features are not better.
In fact, they're worse.
In fact, they're worse. And so that you could use the UBC experience and the UCB experience.
So just to play counterpoint to this,
and I don't want to offend the president's office about branding, because I realize $750,000 spent is important. But you could write that right now, and that would be a very, very important message.
I agree with you, Mike. I think that it has to do with the idea of affordances in the system and the nature of tools and the cultures in which tools are embedded and how it allows people to interact socially in new ways. I think that's great, and I think you're right on it. But do you use a scientific calculator?
I don't.
What do you mean?
I mean,
what do you mean by it?
I don't know, something with a square root and e to the x on it. I mean, sometimes people imagine there are complicated systems.
This could be a discipline-specific question, but the basic answer, if you put it in some ed journal, nobody will get the message, and you won't get what you want. I mean, you actually want to write this for the New York Times. No, I mean, in fact, point of fact, that's your audience. Okay, your audience is to say, look, here's an unexpected consequence of this. And in various disciplines, it's going to be really different. We don't use scientific calculators in molecular biology in almost 95% of the scenarios.
But I've got to go with Melanie here a little bit as well to play devil's advocate. I mean, if we don't want more complicated technologies, why aren't we still using the color cards? I mean, a clicker is more complicated than a color card, but it also provides some extra affordances that we've decided is valuable. And so I think the question still remains whether these other devices provide some extra affordances that we might find valuable that we don't know about yet. Are they perhaps going to be better than just replacing the current clicker that we use, the current way that we currently use them? Maybe not. But it might allow you to do something that you hadn't thought about before that could provide more affordances and more students.
I'll give you a case of where I would want some enhanced features over a current clicker, which is Class Talk system was wired into the classroom so you could see where people were located and look to sections of the class, which I can't do now. If there happen to be pockets of people getting it right or wrong, I can sort of locate people. That would be an interesting affordance of a system that it doesn't exist now.
Color cards gives you that feature.
Kim.
I use not the standard clicker that we're all talking about. I used one where you can type in the number when I did my student teaching at Netherlands, and it was a small class, and it did seem to work pretty well in a small class. There's no research behind what I did, et cetera, but I'm really hesitant to writing off the new clickers before thinking about them a little bit more in depth and what you can actually do in your classroom. Maybe these new clickers are good in your smaller classroom versus your large lecture hall classroom. And maybe in a few years, we will become savvy with the clicker system, and our students will too, that they will like these new advanced clickers. Because sometimes students now are kind of getting bored with, they could be getting bored with the ABCDE clicker, because all of us, we all use it. And I'm not saying this that, I'm not saying that everybody is, but I mean, it's a possibility. So I wouldn't write everything off just yet.
Another double.
That said, you're right, Mike. I mean, you happen to be right, but we got to argue it for you a little bit.
All I can say is there's experimental evidence. Simple clickers take off, complicated clickers die out.
Right. So I think the objections here are we can definitely imagine how we might be able to take advantage of a more sophisticated clicker technology in a particular classroom setting, because it will have some affordances that could help us to teach in a way that we can't right now with our 5-button clickers. And Mike is just arguing on the broad scale, institutionally, most faculty are still struggling with whether they want to use clickers whether they even want to engage their students in the first place. And at that level, the sort of broad level, I think here it becomes more clear that the complex technology is not going to...
You have another problem altogether. Those simple clickers could disappear because there's no market for them. And this idea that the more the only reason people go to clickers is because it's hard to count all the cards, and your neighbor can see what color card.
Okay, that's actually obviously not all of it, but that is part of
But
it.
that's a major part of it. I find it very, in a class of 400, I find it very hard to count 400 cards. Right? Maybe you're better, but the problem is a practical one. You could see this like over-engineering creep, where all of a sudden everybody has to have an iPad for $500. I mean, I could easily see somebody justify that.
Especially if they were drawing graphs.
And the idea that you could sit there and analyze those graphs on the fly as you're teaching is an absurdity.
Yes.
I mean, it's
Yes.
just it's a destructive absurdity.
So the solution is you get an app for your iPad that makes it look exactly
They
like
give
an
you
iPad.
feedback in the
Your iPad has 5 buttons on it.
So I'm glad we got there, because that is what WebClicker is.
Yeah.
WebClicker is an app that you download for your phone.
Reading about
And so that was another
Yeah.
thing that might be interesting to talk about. You can supposedly use real clickers, real life clickers, and iClick and web clickers in the same class. It just makes your students not
Yeah,
have
great.
to buy.
Let's have the students turn on their
But do we
phone.
want them to turn on their phone?
Everybody turn on your phone now. We're about to start.
Oh, Steve, they're already on.
Yeah, they're already on.
So there is another reason to perhaps go with other ones. It depends, leaving the iPad part aside, which is kind of my realm, I guess. But depending on what other technologies you're using in your class. So when I was teaching high school physics, I had a smartboard in my classroom. So for me, I thought it made good sense to go with what was then the Centio, but the clicker that integrates with that software, instead of having to run another piece of software on top of the notebook software that runs my smartboard. So depending on what else you use in the classroom, I think there could be an argument to use different clickers for that. Now, that's not saying more complicated is better, but something that integrates with whatever you're doing makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, Ed Prather has made some, in fact, compelling arguments for the advantages of colored cards, or his version of colored cards, compared to clickers. And my...
Sorry, what are those?
Yes, what are those advantages?
So the primary one is that when students hold up their vote, you can see what everybody in the room is voting, and you can address blocks of people who have ideas.
So you're not trying to count necessarily, you just have that visual
Right.
impact of one versus the other.
So why is that good? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
He is...
The
So
students have lost the anonymity. You're now targeting the people
Oh,
who
it's
got
No, so that's what's bad.
Not as
That's not what's good. So what's good?
Yeah.
That you can see the groups, and then how do you react in a different way than you would otherwise?
I didn't quite catch what was good.
Can I have somebody who said B? Oh, somebody from this group of Bs over here.
Right.
Give me.
Right.
Give me
Tell
a
me,
sense.
tell me about the reasoning for B, and you know who to look at, and
Okay.
you know there's a group
Or you
over
know
here
if
that
they're
all believe B, so
consistently
you're going to hear
wrong.
the reasons for B. Whereas
You can keep
in my class, it's really hard to do that, especially if I've shown the histogram.
Yeah.
You know,
don't know that.
with his system, it's not colored cards. He's got this little piece of paper that you hold up. You know,
Hold it.
so in fact, it's not very visible to anybody in the room
It's the
except
same level of anonymous. Right.
But how do you
Well,
get people to
maybe.
participate? When I used colored
Yeah,
cards
how do
10
you
years
prevent
ago.
So I went to a workshop
and
with
it
Ed
was very
Prather,
hard
and
to
he
do
had
that.
every single person participating, and so I decided I'm going to be the student. So I just didn't raise my colored card. And Ed Prather walked up to me in front of a group of 50 people in a workshop. He's like, "I'd really like to see your vote, Steve." So you know, he really I mean, he's very aggressive, and
Yeah, but he has to be.
But how big
That's
is the
the
class?
problem with
How
colored
big is
cards.
the group?
So the
You have
thing
to be
is,
aggressive and controlled.
let me
You did
sort
it
of
in
finish
class,
the
Dave.
thought. Ed Prather
You did it with the class.
is really quite a master, and he could do this in a class of 25, and he can do this in a class of 500. I've seen it happen.
But it takes a
And
master.
and I don't believe, right, it takes a master, that's exactly right. I don't believe that the colored card technology that he's promoting is going to spread through the, you know, the institution of higher learning, because most of us are not capable of being Ed Prather.
But everybody can afford it.
But, yeah.
Oh, you'd
sacrifice
be
is
surprised.
perfect.
We went through 100,000 colored cards once.
Yeah.
Oh!
And it became expensive. The problem is the students stopped bringing them to
That's right.
class. And so we had to put them out in dispensaries so that when the student
Which
didn't
made
bring
it
to
even
class,
more
they wouldn't have-
encouraging to just leave them
Yeah,
in your
right,
room.
exactly. With feedback, we were filling those things every week. So the fade was a real problem.
That's why Ed's approach is actually kind of nice. It's just a simple piece of paper divided into 4 with A, B, C, D in colors.
Right.
And if you lose it, he has it on his website for you to download and